Good afternoon, everyone. I see that we've got people joining. I'm going to give us just perhaps one more minute, and then we'll get things started. All righty. I think we're going to get started. I like to keep us on schedule and want to wish everyone a happy St. Patrick's Day. Uh, I'm thrilled that some of you wanted to join us instead of have an afternoon Guinness. Perhaps you're like me and your Guinness is waiting for you with your corned beef and cabbage. But it's good to have all of you. I'm Sarah Lee Morrissey. I am very proud to be the chair of the Public Schools and Communities Division of the American Planning Association. This actually is our first webinar as an APA division. We have recently been approved to be a division, and we are also now an authorized CM provider. So those of you who have AICP and are with the professional planning community, please know that we will be working hard in the future to always be able to offer you CM credit. And today's event has been approved for 1 hour of credit. As a new division, we can now be formally joined through the American Planning Association. You can see that we've put the link on this slide. There's also a QR code for you to scan. Would love for you to join our division. Very pleased to already see a number of you names familiar, and those of you who are current members of our former interest group, the Public Schools Interest Group, I invite you to run on over to the APA website and join formally. Would also like to mention that anyone from the planning community who is going to be in Philadelphia in 2 weeks for the National Planning Conference, I would love to see you there. Both Adam, our vice chair, and I will be there, and we will be celebrating and sharing some thoughts from a membership survey and getting people's ideas about where we want to continue the efforts that we've had underway. One of our missions is to strengthen the relationship between the professional planning community and our public school districts. And I really think that today's webinar is a great example of why that is so important. I want to thank Shannon Jacks. You're going to hear from Shannon in just a minute. Shannon is now the chair of our programming committee and has put this together. She will introduce our guest speakers, but this is a great first webinar for us as a division, and I want to thank Greg Leroy from Good Jobs First and his colleagues for joining us today. Shannon, I appreciate your energy. You've always got great ideas and lots of energy. And of course, WXY Studio and Adam Lubinsky and Lyriel O'Neill are our behind the scenes technical support for today's webinar. So I appreciate the good work that they do as well. Without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to you, Shannon. And we look forward to today's content as well as some discussion.
Great. Thanks, Sarah Lee. A few housekeeping items. Please share your questions in the Q&A section that you see. We'll be monitoring that and we'll present those to the panelists after the presentation. You notice we're recording the session, so it will be available to those who are drinking that Guinness right now. We'll put it out in our next newsletter, as well as post it to the division's LinkedIn account. Don't forget to register for your CM credit at the end of the session. And we do have two very quick polls. So I'm going to ask Lyriel if she can put the first one up. Getting those numbers up there, we'll see. Hopefully we'll get close to that total number of participants soon. There. All right, can everybody see it? Mine looks a little bit different than maybe everybody else's. But so right now, vast majority have not joined the division yet. So as Sarah Lee mentioned, we hope that you will, and we hope that you'll be active participants. And from my perspective, I hope that you'll be interested in joining the programming committee so that we have really robust programming that meets the needs of our members. Okay, Lyriel, can you do the second poll? Thank you. Just a few questions that'll help Greg and his team as we go into today. Almost there. Responses coming in. All right. That. Share the results. So it looks like not very many people are familiar with GASB 77. So hopefully we'll have some really good information for you today. But it looks like the majority of our folks are either not sure or do believe that their local school system is impacted by tax abatements. And we're kind of split on kind of evenly. A lot of folks have current debate on incentives, but others don't, or they're not aware. So Greg, I hope that's helpful information for your team as we get into this. Before I turn things over to them, some of you might wonder why the Public Schools Division of APA is hosting a session on tax incentives. Well, first, it's because public schools rely heavily on property taxes to fund teacher salaries, operations, and capital improvements. It varies widely from state to state, from a low of 13% in Alaska to 61% in New Hampshire. But regardless, property taxes are a critical funding source for our public schools. And not surprisingly, tax incentive policies also vary greatly across the country. Some states hold their school districts harmless from abatements and TIFs. Other states allow local jurisdictions to abate or redirect 100% of future revenues a school district would have received from a development project. I happen to live in Kansas City, Missouri, a state and a city that have aggressively used tax incentives, such that Missouri school districts rank 7th out of all states in the level of the abatements that have been granted. And I would argue that this is a ranking where you don't want to be in the top 10. Good Jobs First has this interactive tool so you can see how school districts fare in your state. In Kansas City, Missouri, local politicians for many, many years, and some still today, have expressed that school districts aren't losing any revenues because the projects wouldn't have happened without the tax incentive. And other folks claim that all incentives are bad. I happen to think that both of these arguments are wrong. Incentive reform advocates I've worked with aren't anti-development and they aren't anti-incentive, but are really working to ensure that we aren't over-incentivizing projects and thereby causing schools and public agencies to lose critical resources. GASB 77 data has really helped us locally reframe the narrative. This is a screenshot from the Kansas City Public Schools website where I used to work. We started this a few years ago during a tax incentive policy discussions. The district is now, with GASB data, able to talk about the annual impact of incentives, per student impact, how the district compares to other districts in the region as well as nationally, and how it compares the district's local revenues. And yes, last year, the diverted or abated property tax revenues were equal to 26% of all the local property tax revenues that the district and the local charter schools received, which seems absolutely crazy and insane, but that's me editorializing. This data has also been really critical in helping the district and local advocates develop effective storytelling. This is another screenshot from the website. While KCPS has significantly better working relationships over the last couple of years with the local EDC and has made some good progress in areas of tax incentive policy, there's still a lot of work to do, as Kansas City school districts do not get to decide if and when its property taxes are abated or redirected. Unfortunately, there are 8 other agencies that have that authority. We call it that our alphabet soup of development agencies. Without the help of GASB 77 data and the technical assistance of the Good Jobs First team, we wouldn't have a fighting chance, though, in these discussions. And the Public Schools and Communities Division really wanted to make sure other school districts and public school advocates around the country also know about these resources. So with that very long intro, I'd like to welcome the team from Good Jobs First. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We'll let Greg pull his up and look forward to today's discussion.
Thanks so much, Shannon, and good afternoon, everybody. Good morning on the West Coast, I guess, still. My name is Greg Leroy. I'm the director of Good Jobs First. We'd like to thank the American Planning Association and the Public Schools and Communities Division, and congratulations on your new status as a division. And thank Sarah Lee and Adam for your hospitality today. And Arlene Martinez is our Deputy Executive Director and Communications Director. She'll be helping me with the questions too, as well as Amy Rose, who's our project coordinator on the GASB 77 data. So with that, hope my screen is being shared correctly. And I'm gonna make sure I can get down pages here. So Good Jobs First is 25 years old this summer. And I apologize for not scrolling correctly there. And we're a resource for anyone who wants to try to reform economic development. We work with everybody, journalists, public officials, community groups, everybody, both sides of the aisle. This is not a partisan issue. This is a public good government issue as far as we're concerned. We do a lot of focus on transparency with report card studies, grading states and cities on how well they disclose. And then we captured that data and put it into several databases, a couple of which I'll mention today. These are the bread and butter kinds of incentives that we focus on. It's estimated that as much as $95 billion a year gets spent by states and cities in the name of economic development. And most of this is in the form of foregone revenue, and property taxes are the big dog here, because property taxes are both the biggest tax the average company pays in America, and they're also the biggest source of local funding for schools and other public services. As you saw, about 2/3 of the states get more than a fourth of their funding for schools from local property taxes, and some of them still get more than half. TIF districts, of course, divert property taxes, and you can see the other kinds of issues here. Sales taxes, obviously the local share of sales taxes are sometimes also captured or diverted or abated in these deals as well. And then there's the state effects on the income tax side. Between 2017 and 2019, when Amazon ran its very, very public auction for incentives for its second headquarters or HQ2 project, it really changed the debate in this country. People who I thought should have known better were really surprised to see this behind the scenes story play out publicly. Hundreds of times per year, companies do what Amazon did, although they're not nearly as big a deals as Amazon's was. This was only the 6th time in US history that an auction had been conducted publicly, and it really changed the debate. I think it made a lot more people aware of how costly and not conducive to good public policy, because so many cities spent so much time bidding on a project for which they had so non-existent chances of winning. Many other projects got delayed for many months because of this episode. The big nub problem here is the tax incentives almost never determine where companies expand or relocate. They don't because they can't. And I know that sounds counterintuitive when I say that they're expensive, but when companies weigh where to go, they look at both costs and benefits, and both of those matter a lot. And on the cost side, all state and local taxes combined are that blue slice of this pie chart. They are 1.8% of the average American company's cost structure. So if you're talking about giving a company a tax break, you're talking about shaving off some piece of 1.8%, which is to say tiny variations in the big cost variables that make up business basics: labor, occupancy, raw materials, logistics, energy, IT, CEO bonuses. Any tiny changes in those big variables would dwarf anything you can do with a tax code. And of course, companies need skilled labor. They need good infrastructure. They need quality of life. So they're also looking very much at the benefit side of those ledgers as well as the costs. We know from long-term academic literature that when government spends money on the 98% of things that matter to companies, like the skills base, which is to say K through 14, and infrastructure and public health and safety, we know those work, that they are the proven winners for long-term job creation and personal income growth. But as Shannon described in her state, I apologize, this is really I'm having trouble flipping here. As in Missouri and many other states, we have this kind of stepchild status for school boards, in which under state law enabling incentives, cities and sometimes counties are given the authority to grant abatements or enterprise zones or create TIF districts, even though most of the revenue affected by those decisions would otherwise have gone to the school district. So in most states, school boards are powerless. Now, obviously, school funding formulas then interact with the resulting effect. But in our findings, when we did a big study on this a long time ago, we found that even with offsetting formulas and equalization formulas pursuant in many cases to class action litigation on adequacy and equity, school boards still aren't made whole at the end of the day for the effect of the abatements in most cases. We've also seen in recent years this persistent problem with what we call mega deals that has extremely large single transactions like the ones listed here. These are not anomalies. These are single transactions, single projects in which companies are being granted more than $1 billion a year for incentives. And I apologize for my dog going berserk upstairs. Mega deals matter because they're really a measure of capture of special interest capture or corruption. And they are really the opposite of government spending that would promote equity and economic resilience. So last year, for example, we had more mega deals, single facilities getting more than $1 billion each. We had 8 of them last year than at any year in US history. These companies, 5 of them involving electric vehicles or electric vehicle batteries, 2 involving microchips, and Nucor, the steel company, all got deals in excess of $1 billion. In the case of Micron, almost $6 billion from the state of New York. VinFast is a Vietnamese car company. Rivian is a startup electric vehicle company. So to the extent we can put a price tag on these deals, the average cost per job is $658,000, which is to say there's no way the public can ever break even on such transactions. There's no way the average worker at any of these facilities is going to pay that much more in state and local taxes than public services they and their families consume. Data centers, which are extremely capital intensive, but get massively subsidized. We did a study finding some of the big internet providers getting subsidies of almost $2 million per job. Amazon, the e-commerce company, since 2012, when it changed its strategy and veered away from sales tax avoidance and veered toward rapid delivery, has been on a giant jag seeking subsidies, mostly for its warehouses as well as its data centers and other subsidiaries. It's now getting averaging about 24 to 30 payout subsidies deals per year, and they total more than $5.1 billion. There's also a racial element here. We keep finding this in the data, and you'll see as I move on here. In one investigation looking at multiple deals in the Chicago area for Amazon, predominantly African-American or Latino suburbs were paying much bigger subsidies to get the warehouses than were predominantly white jurisdictions. And if you want to see more about company-specific deals, we have a database called Subsidy Tracker, which is very easy to search geographically or by company or by parent company or subsidiary or by program or just company like Amazon. But now let's turn to the accounting rule at hand today and the subject of our first survey question. So just to define our 2 key acronyms here, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, despite its name, is not a governmental entity. It is actually a project of a nonprofit group based in Connecticut. It creates and promulgates GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, GAAP. That's the source of the phrase you may have heard, GAAP accounting. And GASB continuously improves and updates GAAP by issuing statements. And the process of issuing statements is very lengthy and convoluted and involves exposure drafts and public comment periods and extensive research and deliberations that can sometimes take years at a time for a single statement. So in 2015, GASB, responding to our criticism and those of many that we found out later they've been getting for many years, finally acknowledged that these big economic development tax abatement deals are a salient financial issue that should be codified and recorded in the bookkeeping records of public government bodies. So they issued Statement 77 on tax abatement disclosures. It's a big deal in the history of municipal finance. Government spends lots of money through the tax code for both economic development, but also lots of other things, preferences to seniors, preferences for environmentalism, preferences for homestead rights or whatever. but economic development tax abatements are the only form of tax spending that GASB has ever codified. The record shows up in a note in the ACFR, the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. These are backward-looking spending documents that governments issue after they close out their books for the fiscal year. And the majority of governments in the United States, of course, close their books on June 30. Some do at other periods, but we tend to get a lot of new ACFRs every year, starting around Thanksgiving through April. There's a lag time from June 30 when they close books. So we're now in the middle of the period of getting the fiscal 22 records and ACFRs. The data is crude. We argued for better data, but we didn't win it. We didn't win everything we want. You don't have to name the companies that are getting abatements. You just have to say what the program consists of and provide the one single dollar figure for the amount of revenue that you lose. To its credit, the rule does cover school districts or any other body of government which lose revenue passively because of the actions of a different body of government. And as I'll show you, about 3/4 of the counties, cities, and school districts in the United States, we expect should be and are or will be complying with this rule. Although the data is crude, it's broad. A survey by GASB found that roughly 3/4 of jurisdictions at the local level use GAAP accounting. There's three reasons why governments use GAAP accounting. In the cases of these green states, under either state law or administrative code, the school districts are required to use GAAP accounting. In many other states, schools use GAAP accounting if they receive more than $750,000 from the federal government, which obviously is mostly referring to Title I schools to meet federal reporting requirements. And a third big reason, and which really goes back to the raison d'etre for GASB and GAAP, is that a lot of jurisdictions of every kind use GAAP accounting because it enables them to get the best possible credit rating and lowest interest rates when they borrow money on Wall Street. That was really the original impetus for creating GASB, was to help create a unified form of accounting for Wall Street to make it easy to get the best possible credit ratings. If you want to know how this all plays out in your state, we've actually written a roadmap for you. We have a section on our website called the GASB State Roadmaps, where you can click on your state and get a detailed 14-question answer sheet on who governs GAAP in your state and where the ACFRs go. In some cases, your states, the ACFRs are collected by your state treasurer, auditor, or comptroller. In other states, the school district ACFRs are collected by your education department or your education commissioner. To demonstrate what I'm talking about, passive losses, this is actually an official training slide from the state of New Mexico. So Bernalillo County is the county which includes and surrounds Albuquerque, New Mexico. And if it were to grant a $1,000 property tax abatement to a company, the 6 pie charts you see here, the 6 pie pieces, would all lose money in such a transaction. The state would even lose a little bit, the county, of course, itself, and the city, as well as the school system and the hospital and the community college system. All 6 of those bodies of government are then obligated under GASB Statement 77 to report the revenue they lost to that program of Bernalillo County in their ACFR. This has enabled some terrific new journalism with early data coming out. So, for example, people in Nevada were very concerned about the effects of the Tesla deal up near Reno in the northern part of the state. And you can see Story County and Story County School District there were very greatly affected by the revenue losses accruing from that program. We also find some very revealing things in these ACFRs. Sometimes people feel obligated to explain themselves away or excuse the effects. So in this case, a New Jersey school district is basically saying the school district didn't lose any money because we raised other people's property tax rates, their millage rates. That's not an unusual thing to see in these ACFRs, frankly. And we've always argued that there really is kind of a burden shift here going on. If a company, if a project succeeds and a company induces economic growth, there's going to be new public sector costs. You're going to have to hire more teachers and pick up more trash, and none of that's free. So everybody's going to have to pay a little bit more who doesn't get the abatement. Amy of our staff maintains a database, which we created 6 years ago, called Tax Break Tracker, where we're actually crazy enough to read tens of thousands of PDF documents, these ACFRs, and cull out the numbers and put them in the database for schools, cities, and counties. And we also have now published a series of fact sheets for most of the states. We're finishing them now, in which we look back at the first 5 years of data, 2017 through 2021, to say what are the trends over time in how much money is being lost. So, and we've also published 2 national surveys looking at more than 10,000 school district ACFRs around the country. Our most recent one found that more than 150 school districts lose more than $1,000 per student per year. I should add that in the map that Shannon showed, in the gray states, those gray states are states in which school districts are not independent. They don't report separately financially. It's especially true in New England and the Mid-Atlantic. And therefore, we can't report any ACFR data for the schools themselves, although we have in one state now, New York, made some calculations, which I'll show you in a second. The then Superintendent Bedell of Kansas City looked at the data and noticed that his Black and brown student body was losing almost $2,000 per student per year, compared to white suburbs that were losing less than 100 per student per year. And that's really informed the Kansas City School Board's push to reform the incentive program there in a way that doesn't hurt the school district so badly. In New York State, we recently released a study in which we took both the ACFR data for hundreds of school districts, along with apportioning the abatement losses in the five biggest cities in the state, which don't have independent school districts, including New York City. And when you do that, the number is $1.8 billion per year lost in just that one state. Head and shoulders more than any other state to our knowledge, although obviously we need to do some other work in some of those other states without independent school districts. South Carolina is the number 2 reporting lost state, and the numbers have gone up enormously. In a 4-year period between 2017 and 2021, the state schools losses went up 65%, and they are absolutely a figure now in debates in Columbia about school funding and the school funding formula for the state, frankly, and the powers or lack thereof between the counties and the school districts. In Cincinnati, there's been a lively debate off and on, including a lively recent public meeting on this very issue, and some troubled reporting practices, frankly, by both the city and the county on their losses as they struggle to get in compliance with the new accounting rule. In Little Rock, it's very much figuring into the debate over teacher salaries. That's Amy Rose of our staff writing an op-ed together with a local professor. In Columbus, Ohio, the tax abatement issue has become an overt political issue and really the defining issue between competing slates running for the election to the school board in Columbus. It's that visible an issue there. In Texas, the biggest subsidy program in the state, something called Chapter 313, was sunset last year by the state legislature. There's debates about whether to revive it now and whether to do so in a way that would be better or worse for schools. 1/3 of the school districts we identified, 51 of the 149 school districts we identified as being losing more than $1,000 per student per year, 51 of them are in Texas. And tax increment financing has absolutely been a big issue in Chicago. Chicago is an extreme outlier in the use of TIF. It has more TIFs than the next 9 most populous cities in the country. And the money sequestered away by the city, and TIF has figured into at least the last 3 contract settlements between the city and the Chicago Teachers Union, as well as the debate over school closures under Mayor Emanuel. And in Louisiana, a faith-based campaign run by a church-based group called Together Louisiana is now in the process of winning an enormous amount of money recaptured from the state's very unusual and very corrupt, in my opinion, property tax abatement system. Almost $1/3 billion is now flowing back to public services, especially schools, thanks to this campaign. And the number is increasing in the year as the reforms play out over time. Finally, I just want to remind everybody on the phone today, you working in public education, you are the business climate builders, right? You are the cornerstone of a successful American economy. It's been true for years because of the baby boom retirement. It's especially true now on top of the Great Resignation. If you read the site location magazines like I do, the number 1 and 2 and number 3 variables for where companies choose to go is the availability of skilled labor. And you can't have a skilled labor base without a sound education system with adequate funding. School quality is critical if a company expects to recruit people or recruit people to relocate to a good quality of life community. It's also, frankly, there's an emerging body of scholarship that says the first thing you have to have is good quality of life. And at the top of that definition of good quality of life is good schools to attract smart people, which in turn attract promising companies. So for all those reasons, you are the Business Climate Crusaders, and we're so glad you're here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Greg. It's really interesting. Well, one, it's always good to get another primer on the specifics, but also to see what's happening around the country. Both really positive things happening, but also the scale of kind of what the asks are. We've had a couple of questions come in both through the chat and through the Q&A. I'm going to throw out one that's from Robert, who's here local in the Kansas City area. But how will this all be impacted in areas where public school enrollment is declining and or more options for funding go with the student, meaning dollars are getting diverted to parochial, private, or home schools? How are you looking at that? And obviously it varies around the country.
Sure. I mean, I think this is one more contributing factor to the fiscal stress that public schools are facing in some markets. I think that certainly even for charter school advocates, though, to the extent there are public charter schools, they get affected by these, right? Because the amount of money that a public school district would allocate to a public charter school would be affected by this loss of revenue. So we see that connection for sure.
Right. And then is it more common for state legislation to protect school districts or specific actions by a local community or local jurisdiction?
We wish it were more common for the state legislation to protect the school districts. That's mainly the big problem right now. As for example, in states like Florida and Maryland, the net effect of the way the systems interact does shield school funding, but that's very much the exception rather than the rule. So, we think that the state enabling legislation needs to be repaired in ways that gives school districts authority over their share of the increment, or even just takes the school increment off the table. I should have mentioned when I put the New York State slide up that the two chairs of the two economic development committees in the Assembly and the Senate have co-sponsored a bill, which is now before the legislature, to simply take the school increment off the table. And as your map pointed out, 52% of school funding in New York State still comes from local property taxes, and these IDAs, more than 100 of them can abate taxes. It's a really tense issue there.
Do your studies extend to the territory? So Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam?
I apologize. We have not run the numbers there, but I assume they're using GAAP, especially if they're covered by Department of Education money, for example. There's certainly been some issues with tax break transparency in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico itself. We've done some work in that space, but we have not looked at the ACFRs in those jurisdictions.
Opportunity to partner
Yeah,
with a member here.
big oversight here. Thank you for that prod.
Greg, do you want to mention the opportunity zone situation in Puerto Rico?
Sure. There's the Trump tax cut bill passed in late 2017 and enacted something called opportunity zones, which are basically a device by which wealthy investors can avoid or drastically reduce their capital gains taxes on investments in businesses, including real estate. Puerto Rico itself is an opportunity zone now, which was boosted as a help for hurricane recovery. But we're very skeptical of the program because it lacks so many of the basic guardrails that we'd want to see in an incentive program. There's no disclosure, for example. There's no job quality requirements. There's no way to claw the money back if deals don't work out. So that's not a good overlay. Let's put it that way.
Are you seeing the incentives largely affect operating funds versus capital funds?
So the typical finding we made when we looked carefully at the state rules was that the equalization formulas would tend to make this school district whole or close to whole on the operating side, but almost always shortchanged on the capital side. And so that the long-term corrosive effect of these that you could see most often was on the capital budget side.
And what actions can the general public? Oh,
And I applaud the point you made, pointing out the slides from Kansas City about juxtaposing the abatement losses to the capital maintenance, deferred capital maintenance budgets. That's we think there's a real corresponding issue there.
well, and Kansas City Public Schools is a unique situation that we don't have. While capital expenditures are a local jurisdiction funded, we don't have a capital fund, so we've been paying for them out of operating. So all the abatements, at least for us locally, are impacting our operating budget. Whereas that New Jersey example said, oh, we're increasing the mill levy for other folks. That doesn't apply to Kansas City Public Schools. And every jurisdiction is so different. But the conversation we've tried to have with developers is, one, new construction isn't impacted by, equalization or reducing your mill levy so that you don't have the higher increases. So you're losing out on that new construction if you abate it immediately. And then our situation is our mill levy is set. We're not required to adjust it, which means you get hit in big economic downturns, but also, if you have a lot of development happening without incentives, you also see some benefits. Elizabeth is asking, what actions can the general public take to impact the incentive or abatement decisions? You highlighted some things that are going on around the country. What have you seen be the most effective or good ways for the public to be involved?
Sure. So obviously, I hope you have an organization, and it could be anyone. It could be a community group or a PTA or concerned parents group that's already been formed around after school issues or whatever. Look up your ACFRs or look your jurisdiction up in our tax break tracker database to see what the numbers are, and look at the trend over time to see if the losses have been growing over time. And then crunch the simple numbers that we crunched here, like how many dollars per student does that represent? And frankly, what else could be done with the money? Talk to your economic development officials in the city and find out what they know about whether they think the programs are well targeted, whether they can be positive that companies are really delivering on their promises. Look at the minutes, insist that the deals be disclosed in advance so that they can be publicly debated in case there's problems with the deals. Getting engaged in economic development is not rocket science. It's mostly persistence and a little bit of shoe leather, frankly. And then, if there's a problem, if the costs are excessive, if the trends are going up, if the programs are loose or unaccountable or they're hidden and people are denied the right to participate in the process, those are all big red flags. And that means it's time to organize and demand a further airing of the debate about the costs and benefits of these programs. I'll say this, this system, the way we have it in America, is not a new system. It actually started evolving in the 1930s. But for 80 years, we had a debate about costs and benefits, except we didn't have the costs because we didn't have GASB Statement 77. Only now, for the last 5 years, can we have a balanced, informed debate in which the politicians can brag about the benefits and everybody else can also see the costs, thanks to the financial accounting.
Greg, here's a question from Joseph. Would the adoption of a land value tax system have any beneficial effect, or is that completely a separate issue?
Well, so adherents of the economist Henry George, the late 19th century, sort of the first rock star economist who brought us land value theory of taxation, make a compelling argument that if you change the property tax system to tax land based on the degree to which it's developed, especially with infrastructure, you can do a lot to balance these distortions and bring adequate funding to public services. I mean, it assumes you're not doing abatements. It assumes that you're charging people for sitting on land and leaving it idle, even if it has roads and sewer lines and things like that. There is a modest body of scholarship arguing that certain places in the state of Pennsylvania that have adhered to this theory have done somewhat better fiscally. I think it's a theory that had interesting applicability in its time. I think regional economies are a lot more complicated today too.
So Frances referenced that she lives in Michigan, or I should say Frances, or he or she, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
But they have been, the governor's been working to provide good union jobs. But now the governor has helped to bring a battery company, and they're getting a big tax break. Once a project is approved, how long does it take before really the data is available to start seeing the impacts of the tax breaks on the local school system?
Yeah, Michigan is a tragic story, right? Because you've had this long history of General Motors, especially disinvesting the state while extracting more and more tax concessions. It's this tragic love-hate thing that the state and the company have had with each other, as well as the other big three, but especially GM. The Act for Data is just 1 year snapshots, right? We tried to argue that in the same way that governments must now project their pension obligations based on actuarial assumptions, or their retiree healthcare benefit costs in future years based on projections, we said, the GM deal, the battery deal, comes with a fiscal note. We can tell you how much the state and local governments are projected to lose based on that deal. Why don't you give us that data too? GASB did not agree, unfortunately. So we're only going to get 1 year snapshot at a time. And those numbers won't show up big locally, for example, in the battery plant for probably 2 or 3 years, because they're going to have to build the factory first before the value of the abatement would really kick in, because the assessed value of the newly built factory would be on the books.
The question, but Ken mentioned in Louisiana, I know you cited a little bit of what Louisiana has done, but their governor's policy is not to approve any abatements that local officials oppose. And their school district adopted a policy that will only give the governor an okay to grant an abatement if the project has not been done yet, and will employ significant numbers and typically local public parent population subgroups. I wish we had that much authority in Missouri.
The Louisiana story is complicated. Since the 1930s, the state the big oil interest essentially wrested away control over local property taxes away from local parish governments, away from parish school boards and sheriff's juries and so on, and put it in control of a single state board appointed by the governor. And for 80 years, that board rubber stamped everything, such that about 2/3 of all the industrial, personal, corporate property of the state was off the tax rolls as of about 2017. Under the reforms that Governor Edwards has put in, giving control back to local authorities so that the state board is not just a one-stop rubber stamp anymore. Only about 50% of the corporate personal property is off the tax rolls, and that number is shrinking as more deals, old deals age out, and as fewer deals are allowed into the pipeline. Already it's worth about $300 million in new public revenues, and a study suggests that that number will go up to about $1 billion in new revenues over several years if the reforms stay in place. Governor Edwards is term limited at the end of this year, and the reforms rest on his executive orders and appointments.
But I do want to lift that up, Kenneth, as a really great example of a local community taking control of the abatement process, or at least really trying to direct the process. I think a lot of local communities don't understand the power that they hold in these deals, or trying to block or oppose or weigh in. So the fact that the school district took that really proactive step is great.
Yes, apropos, for example, of the point you make about they only will approve deals that haven't actually started yet. The ExxonMobil headline I put up in my slide, in that case, the facility had been constructed and had been operating for almost 2 years when the company asked for an abatement. There was no pretense that the tax break was going to cause the thing to happen because it had already happened. So that was another reason why they picked that fight.
The question that relates to what you just said, but obviously that was a unique situation. Is there a fear that without incentives, companies will leave the US in general, and the impact that would have? Do you see that being a situation?
Great question. We actually have on our staff a professor, a retired professor, who's an expert, a global comparative incentives expert. And he's written a lot about incentives in both the European Union and Canada, and to some degree other countries as well. The European Union is the best equivalent, right? Because that's the other big block of industrial democracies, some of which are comparable to our state economies in size. As early as 1957, the countries of Europe realized that the competition for capital and jobs was such a budget buster, such a potential corrosive budget busting problem, that when they wrote the Treaty of Rome, creating the European Union in 1957, they created a system within the Constitution of state aid restraint, which to this day still prevails, and basically provides for a very uniform, rigorous way of saying, okay, we have some depressed areas in the European Union, and we will favor investments in those areas, but those are the only areas where you can get state aid. If you want to locate in prosperous areas, have a nice day. And it's fascinating to watch many of the same American-based companies, or even global tech companies, getting massive subsidies for things like data centers and warehouses and facilities here in the United States, get either no subsidies or microscopic subsidies by comparison in the EU, and yet they still build in the EU.
Lee asked, how is Good Jobs First funded?
Sure. About 80% of our funding comes from foundations, about 20% from labor unions, or maybe 18%, and about 2% from individual donations. And we also are now selling some of our data, so that's going to ramp up a little bit of our budget as well. Our budget currently is about $1.3 million. Glad to disclose the names of our foundation funders for anybody that asks.
Well, Arlene and Amy have been putting some really great links in the chat. So, we're getting close to end time, but we'll leave this open for a little bit so that folks can copy and paste and take it with them. I'm checking to see. Nathan, it's not a question, but I don't know if you're familiar with the recent Folger deal in New Orleans. Greg, is that familiar at all? It sounds like, sounds like yes.
We had a hilarious episode with somebody involved in that fight recently. Yes, I guess Folgers has been working very hard. The roasting facility in New Orleans has been fighting very hard for appealing its turn down on an abatement. And it looks like they're gonna, well, I don't want to prejudge it. Hopefully they'll end up paying their fair share. Of course, everybody else says, well, what about Cafe Du Monde? But, you know, what are you going to do?
Here's another good, I think, clarifying question. When you say that GASB 77 applies to governments that lose money passively through abatements, does this mean that it doesn't apply to abated school board taxes where the school board did have a say in making that decision on the abatement?
Oh, good question. Thanks for the clarifying question. No, no matter how a jurisdiction loses revenue, it must report. Whether it was a passive bystander, whether it was a co-participant, whether it was the primary mover, it has an obligation. The one small difference here is that if it is the prime mover, it has a little bit greater obligation to provide more details. It has to describe the program. It has to explain whether there's clawback safeguards in place. It has to cite the state enabling statute that empowers the program. Those are all responsibilities of the actively abating government, but not of the passive losers. Great question.
Right. Any other questions before we wrap up?
You know, Greg, I didn't know anything about GASB and its availability, even though I knew all about CAFR. Is there any concern about accuracy in the reporting, or how do we ensure accuracy?
We have many concerns about accuracy. In fact, I almost left a slide in my deck about some of the states where we have the squirreliest problems with some of the ACFRs. We, as you'll read in the roadmaps, GASB itself is not the police department. It does not do anything about enforcement or oversight. It's really up to state officials, usually the auditor or the treasurer, the comptroller, sometimes the education commissioner. And the degree of attention that those offices pay to GAP compliance varies a great deal. Some of them do a good job monitoring and assisting local governments. Some of them have, graduate programs in state university systems to provide technical assistance and coaching and refresher, kind of like continuing education curricula for local financial officers doing this reporting. Others don't. Some states monitor the reports carefully, looking for fiscal distress in case there's going to be a municipal bankruptcy. Most don't, but some do. So it's just a very uneven landscape, frankly. And we've even had some, and then sometimes it just gets down to the individuals heading the departments. Without naming names, we've had a couple of auditors that we think are just kind of missing in action, frankly. And it's up to people in those states. We'll be glad to help you shake those people by the lapels to get them back on the ranch.
I do want to add, the reason that we know sometimes that the reporting may not be accurate is because we know there was a pretty substantial subsidy deal in that community, which means it should have been reflected in the ACFR and it wasn't. So that's one way of being able to sort of cross-reference a big subsidy deal and whether it's showing up in that statement.
Right. Yeah, just to explain. So if the city reports a big abatement, and we know that schools are the biggest loser because of the way the property taxes are apportioned, then the school should report, or vice versa. And sometimes we get a report from only one of the affected governments when we know all of them should have reported.
Housekeeping thing. L'Ariel, are you able to enable the copying the Zoom chat? Do that. I've always struggled with this. I take pictures.
I believe we can send it out afterwards.
Okay. We will do that. Okay, well, we are at time. I want to express my thanks to Greg and Arlene and Amy for the really informative presentation and also all the great information that you put in the chat. You guys are a wealth of information, and personally, I want to thank you for all the technical assistance and just allowing me to vent at times, but also to strategize. And so folks that are out there, those of you that are interested in getting involved locally, or you see things happening in your community and there's entities that, you know, they don't or you don't think that they have this data, point them in the direction of Good Jobs First. They've been a really, really valuable resource. And we will get information in our newsletter about where you can get the recording. And then for those of you that registered, we will send out all the links that were in this chat. So, Sarah Lee, am I missing anything?
No, you covered it. I just want to echo my appreciation on behalf of our division. The work that y'all do it's fascinating, quite frankly. I have to admit, in a state where I am, I feel somewhat protected by all of this and fortunate for that, but we get our hits in other ways. But an enormous amount of work that y'all do and that you make so much of your reporting available to anyone is just a great gift, quite frankly, to those of us who are out there fighting. So thank you. And thanks for spending your afternoon with us. Appreciate that.
Yeah, everybody go have that Guinness, but not until after you join the Public Schools and Communities Division. We're a fun group. Come on, let's go. Greg, Arlene, Amy, thank you. Any last words that you want to say?
We love planners.
At least someone does. That's good to hear.
Oh, we've had some terrific people in our space from planning schools. We love planners.
Right. That's good.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you at an
All right.
upcoming Lunch and Learn.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.